wanted to start out with my op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com. It's titled Pothole Economics, the Disastrous Saboteurs of Our Future. And what I'm doing in this article is drawing a parallel, an analogy, or a parallel really, between badly run HOAs and Republican policy for the United States. Louise and I have lived in 5 communities in the last 30 years that had homeowners associations, or the equivalent. One of them was a marina. And in fact, 2 of them were marinas, one floating homes, one boats. And 3 of those 5 were really well run, including the one we live in right now. It's you know, they save up money in anticipation of future repairs that are needed, right? So, you know, they're setting aside money today for those future repairs. So when those future repairs come due, it's not a shock to the system. But 2 of the HOAs that we lived in were run by people who described themselves as low-tax conservatives. And by tax, they were talking about the monthly HOA fee. And, you know, one of those HOAs, when we figured out what was going on, they had basically no reserves because the houses had been built, you know, 30 years before. And during that entire time, none of the boards, the HOA boards, had been willing to raise the taxes, essentially, to raise the fees. And so, you know, as the roofs were deteriorating and the sides of the houses were rotting out and they needed painting and all these, you know, things that were happening, nobody was fixing it. I mean, these were common areas, right? And nobody was fixing them because there was no money, and they didn't raise the taxes, as it were, to pay for it. Until finally it reached a point where you had several houses that had leaky roofs, and, you know, the dry rot was getting so bad people couldn't sell their houses. And so then what did the HOA do? They went out and they borrowed $1 million from the bank to do the repairs that should have been paid for with money that should have been set aside over the previous 30 years. And so basically what had been happening is for those 30 years, from the time the houses were built until the time we bought one of them, the HOA board had been basically, and all the people who lived in the HOA had been borrowing from the future. They had been living off future revenues. And, you know, when we came in, we were part of the generation that got stuck with the bill. And so they started hitting us with $3,000, assessments. They called them, you know, emergency assessments. There was one for $9,000. And then when it became evident that the roofs were going to have to be repaired, it was like, okay, there's going to be a $20,000 assessment coming. Well, you know, we sold the place. We got out of there. And we're not unique in this. 10% of all Americans who live in an HOA cite the HOA as the main reason for moving. Only 47% of HOA residents think their HOA has made their community better, and only 64% believe that their HOA is actually managing their money well. So this model, this HOA model of living off the future, basically, by not maintaining the present, by not fixing things, by not repairing things. This is how Republicans have been running the country since 1981. This was Reagan's great invention. This is the essence of Reaganomics. Cut taxes, cut back on spending for education, our intellectual infrastructure, schools, our intellectual infrastructure, roads, our transportation infrastructure, rail lines and airports, our transportation infrastructure, our, you know, the water lines. Many cities still have lead pipes, our water infrastructure. I mean, right across the board, just don't maintain things. And what's happened over the past 43 years since Ronald Reagan started this thing? Well, up until 2 years ago, when Joe Biden got the Build Back Better thing passed, I mean, now we're putting America back to work, right? We've got some 37,000, I believe it is, projects that are going on right now all across the United States. 35,000 projects. But what Reagan did is his policies oversaw a $51 trillion transfer of wealth from the homes, the pockets, and the savings accounts and retirement accounts of average working people into the money bins of the top 1% by this process, by living off the future. And now the bill is coming due. Thank you. And this is just, I mean, this is just nuts. That Republicans have been running the same scam. And if you've ever, if you've ever lived in a community that had an HOA, I guarantee you it was one of two kinds of HOAs. It was either a well-run HOA where they've got a couple $100,000 sitting in reserves, and they have throughout the entire history of the HOA, and they're ready for when the roofs go, or when the place needs painting, or when the water, the irrigation system for the lawns and things falls apart, or the garage breaks, or whatever. They're ready for it. You're either in a well-run HOA, just the same way that Democrats historically have run the country, maintain things as you go, and tax wealthy people to pay for it. Or you live in a poorly run HOA, a scam HOA, a Ponzi scheme, type of HOA. And in that kind of an HOA, there are no reserves. And when, they just, when maintenance gets really bad, then they hit everybody with an assessment. And this is a sign that the people who ran the HOA for the previous 30 years were these so-called low-tax conservatives. Let's keep the HOA fees down. Everybody will like us for that. Right. Except future generations. But they don't care, because they'll be dead by then, and they'll have moved on to another place to live. So anyhow, this is, and of course Republicans are asking us to go along with more of this. This is Donald Trump's strategy as well. He wants another tax break for billionaires. When is America going to wake up? I think, my goal in writing this thing about HOAs, I mean, first of all, Louise and I have had this experience. Like I said, we've lived in 5 of them. And one of our kids lives in one right now that's like really in a crisis because they never saved the money over the years. And they're talking about big assessments and all this kind of stuff. So, I see this, and I think probably most Americans have seen this or something like it, or they know somebody who lives in one of these kind of places. And so by talking about the HOAs, I was hoping that I could just make it completely understandable what essentially Reaganomics is. And that's it. That's what Reaganomics is. It's why more than half the bridges in America are considered unsafe. It's why you've got roads with potholes in them. It's why there are still cities that have lead pipes in their water supplies. It's why the electric grid keeps failing in Texas. It's just the GOP way of doing things. We'll be right back.